Okay, so we're going to do 2.5 multiplying decimals. We're going to finish up this section. We went over example 1 where we were just multiplying decimals by whole numbers, and now I'd like you to start your notes with example 2 using mental math. There are two different ways to do this. Number 1, I could set it up just like I learned in class and say 1 35/100 times 100 and actually do out all the math and get my answer. Or I could use a different method and say, because I know that there are 2 zeros, let me get a different color here. If I've got 1 35/100 and I know that I'm multiplying it by 100 and I have 2 zeros. Because I have 2 zeros, I'm multiplying it by a power of 10. It actually ends up being 100. That's a power of 10. Because I'm doing that and I have those 2 zeros, I can move the decimal point in 1 35/100 2 places to the right. So what I'm doing is I'm taking 1 35/100 and I'm moving it 2 places to the right, and I end up getting 135. Now, if I were to go through and actually do this work real quick, I'm going to pause it and I'm going to do it so that you can see it. I'm going to get 135 still. So I'm doing my work here, and then as I taught you in class, I have 2 decimals to the 2 places to the right of the decimal. So I would go 1, 2, and I still end up with 135 because I can get rid of those zeros. So regardless, I'm getting 135. So if you can remember, anything that's multiplied by a power of 10 could be 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, etc. Anytime I'm doing that, all I take are the number of zeros I have, and I move my decimal place to the right. Example 3 is multiplying decimals by decimals. So this is the same idea as multiplying by a decimal by a whole number, but this time I have an extra place to do some adding when it comes to how many place values I have after my decimal. So here I have 4 8/10 times 7 2/10. The first step we learned is set it up just like you would if you were multiplying whole numbers. I'm not actually lining up my decimals, they just happen to line up here. Once I do that, I'm still going to pretend like those decimals aren't there, and I multiply as I would if they were whole numbers. Once I've done all my multiplying, I come up with 3,456. But what I need to do now is figure out how many place values do I have. So here's a decimal place, and here's a decimal place. 1 to the right of this on my top number, and 1 to the right of my bottom number. So what that equals is 1 decimal. Here's another decimal for a total of 2. So I just go down to my bottom, and I go 1, 2 places to the left, and I come up with an answer of 34 56/100. Here's another example, 3 1/10 times 5/100. Now here's something you've got to kind of realize too. When I write this out, I have 3 1/10 times. Remember, I'm lining up the numbers that I have. I've got a 0 and a 5. I don't have to put this 0 in if I don't want to. It just adds more work for me. It's not necessary. Now notice how on here my decimal places, they're not lining up. They're diagonal from each other because in multiplication they do not need to line up. So now I'm just simply going to multiply like I would with whole numbers. And I come up with 155 until I put in my decimal places. So now I have 1 on top, and I have 1, 2 on the bottom for a total of 3 decimal places I'm moving. 1, 2, 3. So I come up with an answer of 155 thousandths. So here order of operations pops up again. The directions usually say evaluate the expression. So if they give you an expression that looks like this, you have to think about order of operations. So PEMDAS says to start with parentheses. So that's what I'm going to evaluate first. I have my pen out here. I have 4 5/10 minus. Remember, when you subtract a decimal, you have to line up the decimals. 3 and 175 thousandths. I add in my zeros for my placeholders, and then I evaluate it. And I get 1 and 325 thousandths. I'm not finished because what I just evaluated was my part in parentheses. So I have to start at the beginning and add in my 2 and 44 hundredths. And because it was next to my parenthesis here, like this, we know a number next to a parenthesis is multiplication. So we multiply it by 1 and 325 thousandths. So I'm going to set mine up over here and do 2 and 44 hundredths times. Now remember, and I'm actually going to erase here because you got to remember I have a larger number here. Let me get a larger number than I do here. Not technically speaking with the decimals, but it has more digits. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that one on top. So 1 and 325 thousandths times, because I only have 3 digits here, don't forget to put in that decimal after, now I can evaluate it. So now that I went through and I added all these, I've got to look over back to my problem and see how many place values I have after my decimal. Up here I have 3, down here I have 2, for a total of 3 plus 2 is 5. So I start here and I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I come up with a grand total answer of 3 and 233 hundredths as my answer. Be very careful on this one that you don't make any mistakes throughout here. This is where you're going to come up with a lot of mistakes. Remember, in this one, these zeros were not placeholders. This was a placeholder, then this one and this one were placeholders. So be very careful there, because that's where a lot of mistakes end up happening.